Okay, good afternoon, folks. 1 p.m. is upon us, so we will get started. You're all very welcome here today, both those of you who have joined us before and supported us, and those of you who are joining for the very first time. So yeah, great to have you with us all this lunchtime. This is our third quarterly webinar of the year, and our topic for the next 45 minutes is driving performance through content. So I am joined today by Alan. Alan's from FactCheck NI. Alan, maybe you could tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, I'm Alan Mabin. Used to work in BT for 21 years and then went freelance. So I do a variety of things from blogging to running conferences and doing online stuff, and also work as a director as part of FactCheck NI, who I'll explain a little bit more about over the next 50 minutes or so.
Super, thanks, Alan. And our very own Gareth.
Hello, everyone. It's nice to have you all with us. I'm Gareth, and I'm the CEO at Fathom. And I maybe look like I've been locked in a cellar, but I promise you I'm not. This is just a little breakout room in our new Belfast office. So great to have you with us.
Super, thanks, Alan and Gareth. Okay, as always, we have a hashtag for today's webinar. It's hashtag UX Bytes. And our Twitter handle is @Fathom_UX. So if you find any nuggets of information throughout the content that we share today, please do tweet us. Okay, so getting stuck into the agenda, here's how the next 45 minutes are shaping up. We will set the scene a little bit, then we'll get into how FactCheck NI deals with content strategy in an age of disinformation. We'll look at how we can apply UX thinking to the content process. And finally, we will share some key takeaways. We'll spend the last 15 minutes of our time together then just in questions and answers. So please feel free to pop your questions in the little questions box as they come to you. We might not get through all of them today, but we will do our very best and we will follow up on our blog. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Gareth to get stuck into the content.
Great, thank you, Mel. And I felt, whilst we want to give Alan as much time as we can, I felt I would indulge myself in a little bit of scene setting just to kind of put content and content design in context as we hand over and think about the role that content plays within the design process. And I suppose I'd like to maybe plant a few seeds amongst those who have joined us to begin to think about content, perhaps in a new way or in a slightly different way, and perhaps for the first time. I want to just explore some common user expectations and common user behaviors that we see are highly dependent on how we think about and how we design content. And I really want to put to bed a couple of dangerous myths, which for reasons I can't quite put my hand on, continue to permeate to this day. I'm hoping to convince you that we should stop saying users don't read. They do a lot. And I hope to convince you to stop thinking about the idea that users don't scroll. They do a lot. So let me try to justify those claims with some data. Let's think about how users read on the internet. The big thing to consider when we think about how users read on the internet is that words and content play a very big part of how we navigate and understand and use the web as users. But users read in a very particular way. They scan a lot. They very, very rarely read word for word. They typically only read word for word when they're in the detailed consideration phase, when they're about to make a decision. And usually what happens is that people's eyes, we know from eye tracking tests, users' eyes are almost fishing. They're glancing, they're scanning. And when they see the little morsel that they want to get stuck into, it's only at that stage that they begin to read. But just because they read in a very particular way, it doesn't mean that we should become disinterested in words or that we should denigrate or demote how we think about content. Rather, we want to apply certain characteristics to content. And to illustrate what I mean, let me share with you one of my favorite content studies of all time. It's quite old at this stage, it's over a decade old, but it was carried out by the Nielsen Norman Group, and it really helps crystallize what well-applied content strategy does to user behavior. The experiment that they ran was this. They imagined that they were the Nebraska Tourism Authority, and this is a picture from Nebraska. And they wanted to work out if they take a chunk of content which had been written for a brochure are there things they can do to that content which would increase its performance? In other words, that would get users to scroll further, that would get them to engage with content more, but crucially would get them to carry out the action that they wanted them to do, which in this case was to click a button, a call to action. So what they did was they ran the first part of the experiment, putting content on this website, which was straight from the brochure. You might call it marketing speak, and I don't say that to denigrate marketing speak, but it's the kind of content and the kind of approach to content that we would be familiar with when we read brochures. So that became the control. So all the performance of the content design was founded around or anchored around this control. So what they then said was, are there approaches that we can take to this content which might help users engage with it more, that might get more users to carry out the behavior that we're looking for? So the first lever that they sought to change was the lever of being more concise. They asked the question, if we make this content more concise, in other words, reduce the word count and get to the point more quickly, will that have an impact in the number of users engaging with the call to action? And the answer is yes. 58% more users engaged with the desired behavior when the content was more concise. They then asked the question, is there something we can do about how scannable the content is? So they rewrote the content, but this time in a more scannable format so that you can see the bullet points and at a glance what's going on. Also, scannable had a very positive impact, with 47% more users carrying out the desired behavior. The final experiment which they ran was to speak in objective terms. So throttle back on the marketing speak, throttle back on the slight exaggerations in terms of adjectives, just get very factual with what is said. That too had a positive impact. Over a quarter of users carried out the desired behavior with this version of the text versus the control version of the text. So the final thing which they did, unsurprisingly, was they combined them all, and they put a program of words together which were more concise, more scannable, and more objective. What was the impact on that? The impact on that was a whopping 124% more users carried out the desired user behavior when we brought a more concise approach to the words, a more scannable approach to the words, and the words were objective. So users do read, they read in a particular way, and the way that they read is that they value concise prose, they scan and value scannable text, and they want the facts. They don't want to be sold to, they don't want to be marketed to, they want to be empowered with information that allows them to make decisions. So words really do matter. And of course, there's a natural relationship between words and scrolling, because scrolling is associated with engagement and scrolling is associated with seeking to find things. And again, some of the data is very instructive there. So whilst the content that we put above the fold is of course very important, we know from endless studies that two-thirds of users' attention sits below the fold, particularly if they're engaged in the content. We know that on mobile devices, 50% of users will begin this scrolling process within 10 seconds. And if you expand that to 14 seconds, 90% of users will continue to scroll. The final thing that we know is that users read long scrolling content more than segmented paginated content. So there's something here about how we put our content together. There's something about constructing the layout of content design as part of a page that tells us we've got to make our long form scrolling content work harder, because when we do it right, it performs better than more segmented or more paginated text. If I could summarize my thoughts around content, something we always say to our clients is this really simple mantra: content is design too. Content is part of the design process. Of course, we think about the interface and we think about the words, and there are separate processes that we often go through as we go through that process, but ultimately they have to sit together. And the best performing digital products see design in that light. So what that encourages us to think about is to think about tone of voice, and that how we talk to users and what we say is important. And you probably won't need me to tell you that many organizations don't give content design the time that it deserves. And as a result of that, content simply gets careless. Here's one of my favorite examples of content getting careless. Task failed successfully. That sounds like the name of my autobiography when it finally comes out. But task failed successfully is just, it's not helping anyone. Closer to home, you can try and guess the organization if you will. I've cut a little bit of its name off. I forgot my password, and it gave me this wonderful error message: email failed to send for some unknown reason. Come on, you can. Well, what am I going to do with that? If you can give me the reason, go and work the reason out and tell me. But again, it left me a little bit stuck. I was in Dublin recently and I tried to get Wi-Fi when I was having my burger, but Supermax told me Wi-Fi portal disabled by management until further notice. Boo, the Supermax managers, how dare they turn off my Wi-Fi? I thought they were fun. Turns out they're not. They've disabled the portal until further notice. Perhaps my favorite example of content gone wrong comes from Android televisions. A lot of smart TVs run on the Android operating system. And sometimes, like all operating systems, you expect to see your TV, but you see an error message. And there was it went viral last year that a number of people who had problems with their Android TV got this sort of unfriendly looking error message with the subliminal message, kill, process, sacrifice child, which just seems, I mean, I'm not sure about you, I'm not into either killing processes or sacrificing children. So content matters, and how we put our content together has a real impact on how users behave and has a real impact on us designing an experience that encourages them to act and respond in the way that we would like. So that hopefully gives you a little bit of background, and of far greater value than me talking endlessly about the theory is beginning to explore this in content, in practice. So it gives me great pleasure to hand over to Alan, who's going to take us through how they've begun the process of thinking about this in the context of FactCheck NI. Alan.
Thanks, Gareth. And so Alan Mabon, I'm part of FactCheck NI. We're a team of independent fact checkers who identify, I guess, important public statements relevant to Northern Ireland. We interrogate the best available evidence, and we publish fact check articles to try and improve the quality of public debate. We believe that the quality of information in a place like Northern Ireland, a place that is coming out of conflicted but still a bit conflicted, is really, really important. And I'm going to explain over the next few slides kind of the what, why, who, where, how that we do that, and give you a few examples and kind of weave in a little bit of you'll be able to see a little of our content miss strategy and where we're heading to with some help from Fathom as well. So what we do, we investigate claims, we publish articles on these contemporary and sometimes contentious topics. We also work to kind of foster, I suppose, a culture of critical thinking within a society like ours. We've trained thousands of young people in schools and also out of school environments. So young people in school and slightly older young people in out of school environments. We spend a lot of time often adding context and usually complexity to what often seems like very simple statements that people have made. A lot of the claims that we look at as fact checkers, they turn out to be accurate or inaccurate, or maybe accurate with consideration, inaccurate with consideration. Sometimes they're unsubstantiated. Sometimes they're just too complex to even rate, but we still love writing about those. We still love trying to kind of explore what that means. Concise is something we strive for, but we don't always achieve it. And it's interesting when we did the kind of work to see how far people scroll down a page, down an article. They really do scroll much further than I would have given them credit for. So that's interesting in itself. Kind of interesting contextual information does keep people's attention. So we target statements that are made in public that can be attributed to a specific person. Sometimes those are politicians or campaigners. Sometimes they're organizations or a report. We look for kind of assertions or allegations that can be validated or refuted, but we have to ignore things that are speculative. We can't really fact check something that is going to happen in the future. So we can only look at things that happen in the past or the present, really. The example on the right is a statement that was made by a legal firm representing an army veteran. And over the last few years, they've been claiming that a former soldier is 54 times more likely to be prosecuted than a Republican or loyalist terrorist. It's a pretty good soundbite. It's been repeated in newspaper articles on both sides of the Irish Sea, and yet it is inaccurate because they just used a snapshot of the current prosecutions that were in train at one particular moment and took no account of the actual history. So when we kind of did a freedom of information to the PPS, we got up-to-date kind of information. We redid the calculation and worked out that it's nearly 5 times more likely, but it's definitely not 54 times. but the truth will take a long time to kind of catch up with the rest. Also, what we don't do, we don't try and examine the intent behind the statement. We don't try and do what some of the American fact-checking organizations do, which they have a kind of a Pinocchio scale of how much of a liar somebody is, or there's one of them has a kind of liar, liar, pants on fire rating that they give people. That's not really our philosophy, and frankly, we wouldn't get very far in Northern Ireland if we tried. And we also don't give bylines for kind of similar reasons in a Northern Ireland context. So what we say, we look at the claims and we leave you to make your own mind up about the people or the organizations who are making those claims. So it's not about kind of catching people out. So why do we do what we do? We're pretty upfront that we want to teach people to think more critically, to be their own fact checkers. Sometimes I explain that we're basically teaching people to do critical thinking through the medium of fact checking. The more important part to be successful at is convincing Northern Ireland to actually tilt their head to one side when they hear something and go, really, is that actually right? And then to open up a new tab in their browser and maybe quickly search and try and find proofs of veracity of something that has caught their eye that seems too simple or too outrageous or too emotional. Orna Young, so FactCheck and I was set up in 2015. Oh no, we were still in the Y, but it's set up in 2015 as kind of a direct response to false information and rumours online in Northern Ireland. And the three founders, Orna Young, Enda Young, and Alan Leonard, well, Orna had done research into the impact of social media on young people in interface areas. And as one of them said, rumours on social media are the biggest issue for conflict in interfaces. And so kind of growing out of that came of the idea that actually doing something about this, teaching people, giving them the tools to actually assess what they were reading would be really, really important. And those dynamics kind of came to play during the flag protests, but also even more recently during some of the kind of disturbances around kind of Northern Ireland Protocol and so on. So it's kind of an important, and critical thinking, I suppose, is about being able to distinguish between fact and opinion. So who are we in terms of, you can count us in any number of ways. There are 3 founders, there are 5 directors, there are 3 part-time staff, there's a pool of freelance writers and researchers, some interns and volunteers in the past, and we're part of a much larger kind of organization in terms of the international fact-checking network, which gives us a bit of credibility in terms of we follow their kind of code of principles, but also it gives us access to all kinds of things that they are up to. Who do people think we are? Well, we're irritating fun sponges. We have been accused of being liberal centre ground, yet slightly left-wing peace processors who have an axe to grind against insert your community of choice here. We're also blamed and lauded for holding politicians and the media to account. We clearly lie about COVID and will be found to be on the wrong side of history, according to one former executive minister who's no longer in politics and was fairly upset when we pointed out a poor use of statistics by somebody he was friendly with. So basically, occasionally people think we're wonderful, but we never let that go to our heads. The example here on this slide looks at a great statement that was made in terms of, are the business rates in Larne the same as Regent Street in London? Now that would be a colossal thing if that was true. And when we looked at it, well, the multipliers are similar. The amount that you have to pay, but because the property prices in Regent Street are so high compared to Larne, the average rates are much higher too. So the multiplier is the same, but not the actual rates that are being paid. So it's inaccurate too. So where do we do it? We take a different approach to most of the fact-checking organizations around the world because we emphasize media literacy and the focus on developing critical thinking, as well as our actual work to do fact-checking. So we do both output content and also do training. That turns out to be really unusual. We want to engage people with the fact-checking process. We believe that empowering people to be their own fact-checking is really important, and we believe that it's got kind of good social, political, economic kind of impact if we can kind of do that. So we offer training to schools, colleges, all kinds of kind of grassroots, community, voluntary sector, civil service, conferences, commercial workplaces, all kinds of places, and people will pick up on our training. Obviously, we publish our fact checks on a website and we promote them on good old social media. And as Gareth might mention later, people read quite far down the articles, even ones that are more than 500 words long. We're signed up to an international set of code of principles. We also opt into Facebook's third-party fact-checking network. So you may occasionally kind of see various kind of posts and things that people have shared, and there might be a bit of a treatment on them that says, independent fact checkers have said this is a bit bogus. So it's the likes of us or Full Fact in London or any of the other organizations that opt into the program who have actually flagged that material and said, well, here's a link to something that explains why it may not be quite what it seems. And so that's one way of trying to kind of police the internet superhighway. But to be honest, it doesn't. It's a small thing. You can't really kind of police everything. This example would be from a private members debate when a local MLA claimed that Northern Ireland was one of the most locked down places in the world with regard to controlling access to education, closing off huge swathes of our economy. Was he right? Well, I don't think he actually realised when he made the statement that researchers at Oxford, they'd actually built a scorecard model looking at a stringency index and comparing global lockdowns. And the UK was sixth strictest out of 185 at that stage. Ireland wasn't far behind at 8th place. But actually, when you drill down at a regional level, it turned out that England and Wales were much more strict than Northern Ireland was. So yes, we were pretty locked down, but actually not as much as other places in the UK. Now, if we kind of click forward as well, I think the next slide, we'll have noticed that good old Canva has been starting to integrate its way into some of our web pages. We've been kind of using kind of social friendly infographics and summaries. And we've been working through a graphic designer, maybe just click on a couple of times, and we'll see we've been kind of working through kind of the carousels of things that you can do on Instagram to kind of tell the story in a pictorial way and get people to come to the website and actually find out more. Briefly, just and for the last 5 minutes here, just give you a bit of an idea of how we do this, and then some of the things that we're actually trying to get people to do on the back of what we're doing. I mean, we basically gather claims from identified by the public. Any of you can fill in the form at factcheckni.org/claims, or email us, or you can WhatsApp us as well. And we look at those claims. We also look for things ourselves. We find things through various tools that scrape through social media and websites. And we also keep our eyes and our ears open to what's being discussed. And we do love an election and a party manifesto because there's a great opportunity. There's usually a few claims in there that we can kind of, and because we're Northern Ireland, we'll try and do something from every manifesto and get a little bit of balance. So there's a claim selection process. We ask, is it important? Is it fact checkable? Some of you are now looking at the one on the screen and going, was that important? Was that checkable? I'll come back to it in a minute. We research what was said when we decide to look into something. We try and figure out what's the context. What did they mean to say? Were they quoting from something that actually we can go and look at to see did they get it right? What data were they relying on? Is it reliable? Is there other data that also backs it up? And how could people do this themselves? So somebody will actually kind of draft the fact check. It'll be edited by one of us in the core team. It'll be reviewed by at least one other member of the team, sometimes by more. As I say, we don't give bylines because the organization publishes them rather than the individuals, kind of for their own protection, but also because we want to, as a team, stand over stuff. And we assign a rating generally in terms of whether it's accurate or inaccurate or unsubstantiated. Sometimes we even write to newspapers if they've published stuff or contact a broadcaster to try and let them know that something was inaccurate or there was a better way of looking at it. And it's another way of kind of usually trying to work in some phrasing in there to teach people how they could have done it themselves or how to figure out that something looks a bit bogus. We are quite self-reflective in terms of we kind of basically constantly look for bias, either bias of the topics, of the ratings. I mean, are we only doing things that turn out to be true, or are we only doing things that turn out to be inaccurate? Are we politically, if they're linked to a party, are we only doing things linked to one particular party? So we kind of strive for this breadth and balance. And real life doesn't often let us be perfectly balanced because sometimes one person or one party will make more kind of strange claims, but at least we're kind of looking for that because we are striving to be non-partisan, to be transparent, and to be accurate. Corrections is an important part of the process too, because we welcome new evidence that either backs up or challenges our claims and our conclusions, and we will update articles and actually point out at the top, when something has been updated. And we have changed the ratings and things when new evidence has come to light. So over 1 million lights in the Lisburn Christmas display. It's pretty frivolous, I got to admit. But it was in all the marketing material in Lisburn where I live. It said that they had 1 million lights. So we kind of we took a look at it because we reckoned actually, those are in a. You can count how many lines of lights there are up the street. There's like 25, and you can kind of. They're very evenly spaced, so you could like pace it out and you could count how many lights there are in 10 meters and then multiply it up. So basically a primary school child could count the number of lights and then add on a tree and a few window displays. And what we found was that the visual estimate was there's around 200,000 lights at best, far short of the 1 million. We went back to the council and they doubled down on their claim, which was unfortunate because they didn't provide really much evidence. And when we looked at it, well, yeah, it wasn't right. And funny enough, the next year, the marketing literature didn't say £1 million, so we claim that as a small amount of impact. So if we just move on to the last slide here, we realized kind of this year, we've we've got some kind of funding from Joseph Rowntree. We've been kind of working through trying to kind of up our game a bit. The website is original from when we started, but we started to kind of think about actually how could we better. Well, our main aim is to get people to think critically. So how could we keep them on the website to actually see some of the actions that we thought they could take? How could we get them towards those what next? What can I do? You know, can I sign up for a mailing list? Can I sign up to volunteer? Can I give you money? Can I look at this how-to that tells you how to do a reverse image search and do some of this stuff yourself? And how can we kind of reinforce to people? Because I mean, basically, like, why would you trust a bunch of people who claim to be an independent fact-checking site? So there's something around actually trying to sell the story a little bit of actually why we're trustable, and also something about just getting them to kind of learn that some of the stuff's actually quite simple. It may not be easy to get all the data, but actually a lot of things you can kind of just open a tab, do a bit of a search, and actually drag an image into images.google and see who else has used it. There are lots of things that you can actually do yourself. And so we've been working with Gareth and the team at Fathom to kind of think through how we could reorientate what is a fairly dated website, but actually not just to make it look nice, but also to kind of get to derive the actions that we would expect from people. So I'll kind of hand over at this stage maybe to Gareth, who'll kind of take it forward.
Great. Thanks very much, Alan. So hopefully what's coming across, folks, is just the degree of thought and the degree of governance and process which underpins how the team at FactCheck NI think about content. So when the opportunity came from a Fathom perspective to work with the team at FactCheck NI, it was one of those opportunities that we were really pleased to get after, because you know, we have clients of all shapes and sizes, and so to be at the forefront of an organization that took content so seriously was just a lovely kind of project to get involved with. And unsurprisingly, therefore, the vast majority of our work focused specifically around the design of content. So what I'd love to do then is to maybe pick up where Alan has left off and start to share with you how we thought about content and how we began to take those processes which Alan has just articulated and begin to reorient them so that when a user arrived on the site, they don't need to know all the stuff that Alan has just shared. We just need to make sure that we bake into the design process all of the things which meet the objectives that Alan has just outlined. So I'm going to come out of presentation, and I'm just going to briefly go into the browser, which is where we carried out the majority of the work that we did for the team at FactCheck NI. So let me start by just going into the design objectives, which Alan has mentioned, and just begin to deconstruct them. So we know we want to increase user engagement, and the way that we're going to do that is we're going to make content easily findable. We're going to make it engaging and readable. We're going to encourage people with content that is like the content they're looking at. We're going to help them answer the question, what next? So if they're reading something on Brexit or they're reading something on Northern Ireland politics, there's always something they can go to next. We don't always do this on websites. You know, there are, I mean, online banking websites, one of our objectives is to make user visits shorter, but in this case, we wanted to make user visits longer. We wanted users to visit more often, and we wanted to optimize the mobile experience. We identified that we wanted to increase trust, and we outlined some of the ways that we can do that. And we identified that we wanted to help people think critically, and we outlined some ways that we could do that. So one of the first things that we did was we had a look at what we might call either competitors or comparators. We looked at other organizations who have tackled similar design challenges to the ones that FactCheck NI encounter and want to overcome. And you know, as I sort of illustrate some of these, I'm certainly aware that FactCheck NI isn't identical to any of the ones that I'm going to share. It's got little bits of different ones. So what we wanted to do was we wanted to go through an ideation phase and ask the question, are there design patterns that we see on other comparative websites which we should consider to be part of the design solution, or to go into the ideation mix, if you'll indulge me an awful UX cliche, to go into the mix of things that we might consider as we thought about how we bring content together for the FactCheck NI users. So here are some of the things that we found as we looked. Full Fact do a lot of things really well. Excellent positioning statement and value proposition, really good and clear call to action. That certainly needs to go into the pile of things to consider. Credible statements of impartiality presented with evidence. If we scroll down here, you can see that they not only claim that they are independent, they begin to make some outlines and details as to how and why they are, and they encourage the user to find out more. There's a request for support positioned on the right-hand side of the page, and there's a succinct, well-presented global navigation. As a slight aside, for those of you who are thinking, oh, that full fact website is very well put together, I'm not sure about that, the color of green in that brand. When you look at their brand expressed on other platforms, it's an excellent color, because when you're scrolling through Facebook or you're scrolling through Twitter, you can see full fact posts really easily, because those colors are so distinctive that when you're not on their platform but you're on other platforms, it really stands out. So I wasn't part of their brand discussion, but it certainly seems to me that they were thinking about that when they chose some of those colors. As we then scroll left to right, you'll see that one of the things that we wanted to get right was some fact-checking websites are very academically fact-checking, and others are moving more towards news outlets. And so we spent a bit of time thinking about the relationship between the rigor that goes behind good independent fact-checking and the need to stay relevant. Get too relevant and up to date, you start to get sucked into the news cycle. Get too far towards fact checking, and you start to feel a bit academic. And again, we spent some time thinking about the balance. We had a look at this site here. It's not in the fact checking area, but it's a website that's a favorite of all of us at Fathom. It's gov.uk, and we're always interested in it because it is a signposting and navigation masterclass. It delivers over 600 public services to people in the UK. And 79 times out of every 100 times a public service is accessed, it's accessed through this portal. So if ever there was an organization that knows how to get users to persuasive content and to give them the confidence to act, it's gov.uk. So we thought about them as well. And then finally, we had a look at Snopes, where they had innovative use of the hashtag, which we'll come back to. So what you can see here is that as we looked at other websites that might feel to users like FactCheckNI, we were able to identify some high-performing design patterns. As we then scroll down to look at how users were engaging with the current FactCheckNI website, there were some really strong things that came across. Because of the impact of COVID on all of our lives and on the FactCheckNI website, you'll see we had a look at analytics pre and post pandemic, and you'll see that this Jeremy Corbyn story has been very, very popular for a long time. However, when we have a look at the COVID piece, you'll see that a number of COVID articles jumped that queue in terms of life after COVID. The Corbyn piece is still in there, but COVID stories are starting to come to the fore. So this has given us some useful clues about the type of content that users are most interested in. As Alan says, when we have a look then at the heat maps in terms of how far users are either scrolling or where they're clicking, what you can see is that on the homepage, users are getting about, maybe a page and a half down on the home screen. But when I scroll over to a content page, what you'll see here is that users are getting really deep down into the article. So what that tells us is that once users find content that they're interested in, the quality of content, as Alan has outlined, is so high that they are engaging with it right to the bottom of the scroll. And that will be very untypical activity based on what we would often see on sites. If we have a look up then, looking not at where users are gazing or hovering, but looking at where they are clicking or pressing, what you'll see here, if we look at this desktop site, is you'll see that there's loads of action on about, there's loads of action on fact checks, but there's no action whatsoever on topics. Now, the term topics came about as an internal reference for areas where FactCheckNI hadn't got to a conclusion. They were commenting on stuff, but they weren't coming to a conclusion. But what this tells us is that users didn't make that connection. They didn't know that that was what topics meant. To users, the phrase topics just didn't really mean anything. And rich to information, rich to articles were all dominated by this phrase, fact checks. So that gave us confidence that the language of the user was the language of the phrase fact checks. As we go over to the right then, one of the other challenges that we faced was that there were a number of subject areas that overlapped. So for instance, we could take Europe and EU and Brexit, all of which overlaps. So one of the challenges that we faced was, how do we take the more accurate term, for instance, Europe, but make sure that we marry that with the more popular term, Brexit? Because users might be looking for a subject about Brexit, but we might have other information underneath that heading to do with Europe more generally. So how do we bring that together? Well, what we decided to do was we decided to introduce a sort of a sub-label or a narrative into it. And you can see here that we've got the original headings on the left-hand side. We've got the proposed changes and labels towards the middle. You'll see we've rolled elections into politics, environment into politics, Europe into Europe and EU. And you'll see then that we've taken that sort of narrative that we see in gov.uk and we've put popular terminology into the narrative. So you can see here that Europe and EU starts with the phrase includes Brexit, the Irish border passports, and the Good Friday Agreement. So what we're trying to do is to merge the more accurate headings with the language of users and with the terminology that users are most familiar with. The final piece of research then that we did was we stood on the shoulders of giants. In other words, the likes of Google in particular has researched this stuff to the nth degree. So if we're looking for the content playbook, content process, making content scannable, building content into menus, Google has done so much of the heavy lifting for us. So in that environment, our job is to take what we've learned about the specifics of the FactCheck NI content, marry that with the design patterns, which Google has told us are the ones which are most effective for users, bring those things together into a wireframe or into a solution. So here's where we ended up. Here's where all of this information came together. I'll just bear with me here. I'm just going to zoom in. So you'll see here that we wanted the way that we married up the fact that we weren't in the news cycle, but we were relevant, was we had information on the right-hand side around what is popular in FactCheck NI right now. We wanted to start with a crystal clear value proposition about what FactCheck is and stands for and does. And you can see that that is what dominates above the fold. And then we wanted to let users get after the content that they were looking for. We've gone for search first as a navigational device, but you can see that we've got the flexibility of those hashtags so that if there's something particularly relevant, trending on social media and so on, users can quickly connect that with that homepage experience. If you have a look at the menu at the top, you'll see the word topics has been removed entirely, and the route to the articles is now via that link, fact checks. Scrolling down then, we do have the latest fact checks, as you can see, and this was how we sought to get the balance between the rigor of the long-term checks and the fact that the website and the content was relevant. You'll see that we wanted to get a pro forma, if you like, a standard way of presenting what used to be called topics and fact checks all on the site by outlining the subject, giving the rating, and giving a short description of the rating. We then wanted to scroll down and let users know what was deeper into the site. And you can see that here on the interface, this is where we began to introduce the top level topics with those secondary level topics so that whatever the user wanted to get after, they could see at a glance exactly what was on offer. As Alan has said, one of the objectives was to help people think more critically, and the training service which FactCheck NI offer and the toolkit were a key part of that. A little bit then about why FactCheck NI should be trusted, some information there. More information about if you felt motivated to contribute to the organization, then that's inoffensively included into the scroll. And then finally, we've got our fat footer. So that was how we married the content strategy and content processes of the team at FactCheck NI with some of the UX thinking to marry that up with data to see what users were doing in the current site and to begin to see the content not from the inside out, but the outside in. Time has beaten me, so I won't say too much other than then to say that we then built out that user journey all the way from the homepage, which you can see on the left-hand side, right through the latest fact check page, a fact check subpage, into the actual articles themselves. So to bring together and to think about not just the homepage experience for users, but the flow through the site as well. So that was how we took some of the content rigor that Alan has just outlined and how we began to apply it to the content which they write on a regular basis and marry that up with user insight. So I'm conscious of time, so let me just finish up, if I may, with the 5 key takeaways we'd love to encourage you to think about as we wrap up. Number 1, make your words scannable, concise, and objective, if possible, all 3. Number 2, write your copy for empirically established user behavior. Know the behavior that you want to encourage and write your content around that user behavior. Establish an appropriate tone of voice. Write with purpose. We've talked a lot about purpose in this. And then finally, implement user data and insight to structure and design content and flow. So that's us through the formal part of things. Thanks to Alan, and I'll hand back to Mel.
Yeah, super. Thank you both. Okay, there's a few questions here that have just came through in the little box just during the presentation. So I'll kick off with one that I'll just open the floor with. So any tips or thoughts on best methods to test content?
I'll maybe kick off with that, but I'll welcome Alan in. Content testing by its nature has to be behavioral, and it's typically driven by analytics, and it's typically driven by A/B testing. And I think the Nielsen example was probably the best example we have. In other words, the way that Nielsen found out that scannable was better than non-scannable and concise was better than non-concise was that they simply tried both options. So the only way to test what content is better is to try it in the wild and see how users behave. And you don't have to test it with all users. Optimization software is mature enough that you can get a subset of users, perhaps only 10% of your users, and run the control and run the variance on them. So it has to be driven by analytics, by behavioral research, and typically in the wild.
I just add, during, I suppose, the beginning of the pandemic, we worked with a local kind of health network, and we produced kind of explainer articles about various kind of COVID-related topics to try and kind of, I suppose, set a baseline of information and understanding about things that were kind of relatively complex. Turns out we all understand about mRNA vaccines now, and we're all experts. But back at the beginning, we weren't. And we put quite a lot of stuff out in social. We had a little bit of advertising spend that we had got. And so we did quite a lot of basically A/B testing, though not formally using Facebook's A/B, but we would put it out to different age groups, different genders. We would do it, and we'd one around kind of pets and COVID, because there was a bit of a worry, could you kind of pick up COVID from your pet, from your cat. And so I even at one stage had a version for cat lovers, because Facebook can identify people who may like cats versus people who didn't like cats. And we kind of realized that if you had a picture of a cat, it was particularly effective with the people who were pet owners and had cats, but a picture of a pet wasn't necessarily that good to advertise from a social point of view for the non-pet people. And so we kind of learned quite a bit about what type of images worked, and also where to put your money, because if you wanted to get basically kind of 60-year-old women on Facebook, that was very cheap. But actually, if you wanted to kind of get the gaps, for us it was more important to reach everybody than it was to overserve one kind of part of the community. So we kind of had to learn how to do that. But it's the same, I guess, in a slightly different way if you're going to do it for mail shots, or you're going to do it on your website as well, in terms of serving up slightly different content. But I mean, there are analytics, and it's you got to also test the analytics to some extent, see whether it's repeatable in a couple of weeks. Is it the same? Was there something going on in society that changed how people were thinking, or is it actually something that's sustainable and you get the same result? But yeah, I think working with Fathoms, we've got to really, without blowing smoke, but it's been kind of interesting, because you come from that kind of point of view of wanting to prove something. You're wanting to see if there's evidence of it, and then to prove, will the changes work? And so that's been a kind of a useful mindset, I think, for us as well.
Brilliant, thanks, Alan. I'll transfer you that tenor just after the
That's quite okay, thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, and yes, is there any kind of tips or UX practices that can help make content more concise and scannable? I think that one's maybe for you, Gareth.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things, Mel. I mean, if you'll forgive me, I'll quickly go back to the fact that it needs to be measured, and we've sort of boxed that off in terms of the fact that ultimately behavioral, analytical, in the wild user behavior is ultimately the only way you can properly measure it. I think when you look at high performing digital products, they like the team at FactCheck NI, they've got professional authors, and if you look across the very best of what we see in UK and Ireland, the best of the web and the best of digital has dedicated UX copywriters who know how to craft words, who understand tone of voice, and who have different modes that they can write with. They can write in marketing mode for the brochure, and they can write in scannable, concise bite-sized chunks objectively for the web. So it is very much it's a craft, it's an art rather than a science, and I think people need to have that skill or that background. People who have a love of the English language and a love of data are the ones who really excel at it.
I have an opinion on most things. I mean, we have a style guide, which we have kind of begged, borrowed, and stolen off various other organizations, and then started to adapt. That's kind of living for us, but it does kind of help us with some of the kind of phraseology or some of the terms that we would use. We are boring by nature. I mean, we're deliberately boring. We're giving a bit of analysis, but we're not giving opinion. We're trying to give facts and kind of give context so people can work through the thing and come to the same conclusion we got to. But we can change our tone of voice a bit for maybe blog kind of pieces or news articles, or at Christmas we've one that we come back every Christmas, with Santa Claus reel. And it's we come to an interesting conclusion, but you can be a little bit more fun with that. But at the same time, as an organization, we're kind of deliberately boring. But actually, I think that because that's a conscious choice, it's not just because we are boring, but we've made it that way, and then we find other ways of expressing it. I think actually the use of visuals, what Gareth says about Full Fact, I mean, like as a team when we saw their rebrand, we went, wow, I mean, that's a mistake. And then we realized what it looks like on a canvas bag, what it looks like on various other things, and the fact that those splurges of color go through all their graphics and all their photographs and things have it, and we kind of realize that actually it makes sense for them. So there's something about the visuals, and we're experimenting a bit with a graphic designer around infographics a bit more, just to kind of figure out there are other ways of selling the story online before you come to read the kind of rather gripping boring version, which actually sets out all the facts in a row. So there's kind of multiple ways of doing it, even for an organization that's going to be very factual.
Super, thank you. And then the last one, Alan, is for you. So you mentioned getting people to think more critically. Is there any, and I think you mentioned image reversion and stuff as well, is there any tools that you would recommend people use in order to kind of come to their own conclusion or do some fact checking?
I quickly look up our website and see which link on the old one, which that we should be, I think probably around Toolkit is going to be a good place to start, because if you scroll down, there'll be a set of things down at the bottom somewhere that give you some ideas as to how you can do that. But I mean, largely to think, check, share is the kind of the mantra that we kind of use, but we're kind of asking yourself, is the information correct? And that's often checkable. Is the source trustworthy? And those are things that Uncle Google or Auntie Bing can help with. And then also to kind of say, emotionally, what is that doing to me? So if somebody is trying to manipulate your emotions, that's often a warning sign that you may not be getting the full story. If you can't see other people talking about the same thing, then that's often a worry. But there's a set of kind of quite easy things in terms of images is one of the big ones. We get a lot of stuff during any kind of rioting or disturbances in Northern Ireland. You see a picture of a car on a street, and then when you kind of literally just drag, if you're in a Chrome browser or whatever, you could drag it into a tab that has images.google, drop it in, see where else I've seen that. And TinEye, Pierre has put it in the chat there, something like TinEye or Google itself will show you where else it's been. It'll maybe show you some of the metadata, or it'll show you whether or not it's been an altered image. There was a good one recently that suggested that a banner about United Ireland had been misspelt. And actually, no, it was a well-doctored thing from a couple of years ago that had, it's nearly obvious when you looked at it, it was kind of one of the letters is a wee bit wonky, but you can actually see, if you're lucky in some of those things, that you can see that in behind the scenes that the amount of compression in certain areas is less, and so that's something that's being doctored. So there's a pile of kind of things, and we've some kind of how-to articles on that, but a lot of the time it's kind of in your heart, in your gut, you feel that something's not just quite right, and then you should always kind of act on that. We kind of say, keep an extra tab open, do a quick search, and ask yourself the questions about the emotion, the source, and whether other people are talking about it. And a lot of the time, you'll not be caught out that way. And interesting conversation for afterwards around where parody and misinformation or disinformation starts to kind of align. You get things that are meant to be funny that we don't think are funny, and vice versa. So there's a wee bit of a kind of a blurred line in there. So it's an interesting one for Facebook as well, and their treatments. So there's a bit of a conversation internationally around that as well.
Brilliant, thank you. And thanks to you both for sharing the content with us today, and for answering those questions. But thanks also to everyone who popped some questions in. The other ones that we haven't got to today, we will answer in our blog. So the best way to get the earliest access to that is to sign up to our newsletter, and you can do so by accessing fathom.pro/sign up. So already we have our next webinar in the diary. It's on the 8th of December, and we're talking about the true return on investment of UX and how to convince internal stakeholders. So we'd love to see you all there. We'll launch the sign-ups just hot off the heels of this webinar, so please keep an eye out on Twitter and email for that. Also, folks, we will follow up with a survey today. So if you can spare 2 minutes, we'd really, really love your feedback and thoughts on what content you'd like us to cover in the future. And just a quick shameless plug then before we say our goodbyes. We're hiring for a project manager. So if you have any project or account management experience and fancy a new challenge, then please do get in touch. Thanks again for your time, and enjoy the rest of the afternoon. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, everybody. All the best.